The idea of making, especially a female character, clumsy, awkward, socially inept, and she falls over a lot, and then calling that a personality, it just doesn't work anymore in the year of our Lord 2022. I went into Persuasion with an agony to hope ratio of about 70-30, just based on the trailer. I had the premonition that it might not be a very faithful adaptation. More importantly than that it might not be a very good adaptation. My premonition was right, and here is me telling you all of the things that annoyed me about this film. Hello and welcome to Spinster's Library. Netflix's Persuasion has been described by many commenters online as the Fleabagization of Jane Austen. That is an insult to Fleabag. Before we get into this video, let me just warn you there will be spoilers, both for Jane Austen's novel Persuasion and for the film with the same title that bears a passing resemblance to it. There might also be swearing because I have feelings about this film and sometimes they come out as me saying fuck a lot. I don't come to this as a massive fan of the book Persuasion. In my Jane Austen ranking, I believe it is a solid 4th or 5th even. I'm not coming to this with a particular attachment to the novel, and still this film managed to disappoint me. You could tell from the trailer that they were trying to make this a sort of modern, casual, millennial adaptation of Persuasion. And in fact, the word millennial I've seen used a lot. In fact, there was even an article that says millennials are ruining Jane Austen, which I'm not taking any responsibility for. Their attempt at making Jane Austen more casual and more modern sounds awkward and cringy and unnatural. Considering one of the screenwriters for this is an 80-year-old man, that doesn't surprise me because a lot of the lines that they added to the film that weren't in the book, specifically the super modernized lines, sound exactly like I think an 80-year-old man imagines a millennial woman like myself to talk. A 5 in London is a 10 in Bath. He made me a playlist. We're worse than strangers. We're exes. Quite the upgrade. I am an empath. How do I prioritize self-care? I love a little bit of family goss. They tried to make Anne, a character in a 200-year-old book, sound like what an 80-year-old man thinks a 27-year-old woman in the 21st century sounds like. You can see where that went a little bit wrong. When people talk about the Fleabagization of this film, what they're referring to is some very obviously inspired camera techniques and directing techniques and acting techniques that feel a lot like the BBC sitcom Fleabag from a few years back. It's not such an absurd comparison to make. In fact, I myself made a video just recently about the parallels between Fleabag and Jane Austen, and there are many. You should check out that video if you're interested in those. So taking a Jane Austen novel and then saying, you know what, let's add a little bit of that Fleabag flair into it, as a concept, is not a terrible idea. But there is a complete disconnect between that approach and the actual novel that they're adapting. Taking the character of Fleabag and just dropping her into the story of Persuasion doesn't work. It's all so blatantly copied from Fleabag, but without any of what makes Fleabag so good and unique. And I can tell you, if Phoebe Waller-Bridge had been paid to make a Fleabag-style adaptation of Persuasion, it would be 1,000,000 times better than what Netflix has just put out. There were bits of the Fleabagization where I appreciated the approach. In theory, for example, when it comes to the introduction of characters, you get Anne talking to camera, introducing her father, her sisters. God, I'm trying really hard to say positive things about this. It could have been a good way of introducing these characters to an audience that hasn't read the film. Short, snappy descriptions. Here is my older sister. She is very arrogant and vain. Here is my younger sister. She is very self-absorbed. It just falls flat because it doesn't fit within the rest of the film. Speaking of characters, there were some I liked. In fact, I made a list because I'm trying really hard to add a little bit of positivity into this video. I don't know why I'm trying. I mean, I don't owe them anything. So here are a list of characters that I thought were decently well done. Anne's father, Sir Walter Elliot, I thought he was very good. Anne's younger sister Mary, I thought was quite well done. She is such an annoying, such a grating, and such a unique character in Persuasion. And I thought they got that mix pretty spot on with the way that she's characterized in the film. You really love to hate her. She's so annoying. The Crofts, they are my favorite Jane Austen couple. They are relationship goals. Every time I read the book, I say every time I read the book like I've actually read it more than twice. I don't think I have read it more than twice, but they stick in your mind as just a really lovely, positive example of a happy married couple in Jane Austen. We don't get a whole lot of these, especially not in the sort of older generation of characters in Jane Austen. They were great. It's a shame they were only in this film for about 15 seconds in total. The Musgrove sisters, I quite liked. They are interesting in that they're not really evil, they're not scheming, they're just a little young and naive. I thought that they were portrayed quite well, especially Louisa. Henrietta doesn't have as much to do in the film. I feel like she has a little bit of a bigger role in the book, but that's fine. And that's it. That's all my positives. Oh, the sets are very pretty. The seaside and Bath, and there's a lot of delicious looking food in this film, a lot of pastries, little cakes. Well done on that. Some parts of the film are very nice to look at. And I'm not just talking about Mr. William Elliot. Anne. We have to talk about her. Anne Elliot, the main character in Persuasion, because she was entirely missing from this adaptation. Let's talk about the characterization first. She is so socially inept and awkward just for the sake of being relatable, which obviously entirely backfires because the concept of making a female character clumsy to make her relatable is outdated by several decades. In fact, several times during the film, I wasn't reminded of Fleabag. I was reminded of a film like Bridget Jones, which came out 20 years ago. The idea of making, especially a female character, clumsy, awkward, socially inept, and she falls over a lot, and then calling that a personality, it just doesn't work anymore in the year of our Lord 2022. It's particularly egregious because this is supposed to be Anne Elliot. And Anne Elliot, who is the oldest heroine of Jane Austen's novels, who is the more subdued one, who is the one who's had somewhat of a life already. She is the ripe old age of 27. She feels like she has barely communicated with another person. She blurts out things in society, she falls over, she makes bad jokes, she's inappropriate, and that just doesn't feel like Anne Elliot. In fact, Anne Elliot is the only sensible, measured person in her family. That's her characterization in the book. She's the grown-up in her family. And here, she feels like a child. And again, I'm not surprised that half of this script was written by an 80-year-old man who presumably thinks that 27-year-old women act like children. They try and make Anne into a funny character. They try and give her a sense of humor, which she actually has in the book, but it's completely warped. A lot of the humor in this film is so flat and boring and uninspired. It's all slapstick and, like I said, falling over in the mud, or talking about the boy you like and he's standing right behind you. Isn't that cringy? It's all shit like that. It doesn't work. You feel patronized just watching it. They're not just doing Anne Elliot a disservice, they're doing you personally a disservice by trying to convince you that this is how an adult woman acts in any situation at all. If they wanted a sort of awkward teenage girl bumbling through her life, there's Catherine What's-Her-Face sitting right there. They could have taken Northanger Abbey, which is set in Bath, has a bumbling teenage girl as the protagonist. Why defile the beauty of Anne Elliot by making her into such a flat, horrible caricature of a person? Let's talk about language. I've already given you a best of the worst lines. In principle, I'm not opposed to modernizing the language of Jane Austen. There is a way of modernizing the language without making it a gimmick, and that's what it is in this film. When Anne Elliot says, if you're a 5 in London, you're a 10 in Bath, it's painful to hear, not just because this is supposedly being said by a woman living 200 years in the past, but because also No one talks like that today. I gotta point out one line that really, really bothered me. When Mary and Anne talk about dancing. Mary says to Anne, "How would you dance to Beethoven?" "Minerva, how would you dance to Beethoven?" Anne says, and I quote, "Alone in my room with a bottle of red." The bottle of red doesn't bother me. There's a few scenes actually, in the film where we see Anne Elliot drinking red wine from a bottle, which I have seen people complain about on Twitter. I think that's fine. Try and make her relatable, try and make her casual, whatever. Doesn't bother me. But how, for the love of God, would you dance alone in your room with a bottle of red to Beethoven 100 years before the invention of the gramophone? How would you do that? You cannot dance to Beethoven alone in your room with a bottle of red unless you also invite a string quartet into your room. It's obviously deliberate, right? Whoever wrote that line was well aware that it's impossible to dance to Beethoven alone in your room with a bottle of red, and they put it there anyway. It's again this idea of making Anne Elliot relatable by putting lines in her mouth that the writers thought someone like me might say. Drinking wine straight out the bottle, crying in the bathtub, being belly down on her bed, walking into the sea in a dress at one point. All of those things, they can sort of take or leave. They're just very common ways of historical dramas trying to add dynamics into it, trying to make the people of the past seem like actual people. I don't love it, but I don't hate it either. However, there are other things that take you out of the time period completely. And in particular, I want to talk about hair and fashion. I am not an expert in Regency hair and fashion, and I'm sure that there will be video analyses of the hair and fashion in Persuasion, and I cannot wait to see them. But one thing that I noticed was that Anne Elliot seems to have been dressed by a completely different person with a completely different concept to everyone else around her. It's really grating to see scenes with her and her sisters, for example, at the breakfast table, and all of the women around her have like an updo with, braided bits and little curls and all of that. Minerva, come here. You're being noisy, but you're not being cute. What's the point of you? So all of the women around Anne Elliot are dressed in what looked like it might be Regency clothing. They had like the empire waistlines and the various different shaped necklines and the little the puffy sleeves and whatever. And then Anne Elliot wears like a button-up shirt with a little round collar and a beret and hair that looks like it was taken from someone's Pinterest board from 10 years ago. She looks like a time traveler from 2007, and everyone's too polite to mention that to her. In every scene when she's in with other characters look like they're from the period, and she looks completely out of place. The hair bothered me, I think, more than anything, because she wears her hair down, she has a little side fringe. It just doesn't work. Anne Elliot was dressed by the same costume maker who dressed all of the other characters in the film, and they made a conscious decision of making her look entirely out of place. Because presumably they thought, oh, we like that Fleabag character. Let's see if we can stick Anne Elliot in a jumpsuit, figuratively. Thank God they did not actually put her in a jumpsuit. She looks and acts like a stranger in her own film. She does not fit in this story at all. Visually, in terms of how she behaves, and in terms of what she says. And that is just so odd. If it was a deliberate choice, which you have to assume it was, I have to ask myself why. And I think it's lazy filmmaking. I really think the people who made this film saw something like Fleabag or even something like Bridget Jones. It's also being compared to Bridgerton, but honestly, I don't see any similarities to Bridgerton here at all. Tried to pick and choose from other things that were successful and tried to sort of mash it into a film. It didn't work. I found with Captain Wentworth, the way that he was characterized, the way that he acted, they tried to take Colin Firth from Bridget Jones and from 1995 Pride and Prejudice and tried to put him in Persuasion, which also doesn't work because Captain Wentworth is not Mr. Darcy. They're different characters. They act differently, they behave differently. So you have these two people. You have Fleabag knockoff and you have a Mr. Darcy knockoff talking past each other with absolutely zero chemistry, and you're just wondering what you're doing with your life really while you're watching this. I also made the mistake of watching this sober and while I have COVID, which cannot recommend. My other complaints are just kind of minor and insignificant compared to what I've just talked about. Lady Russell and the Crofts weren't in the film as much as I would have liked. They are both good characters. I thought they were portrayed quite well in the film. There's some awkward things about Lady Russell that I'm pretty sure weren't in the book. But yeah, they were cut. That's a shame. Anne's friend in Bath was cut. I'm trying to remember her name. I think it was Mrs. Smith. The music was kind of bland throughout. It's very, very standard rom-com music. And then at the end, there's this weird indie pop song that is just insufferable, did not fit the film at all. But by that point, I couldn't give less of a shit. Like at that point, they could have played the theme from Countdown and I wouldn't have minded. They gave Anne Elliot a pet rabbit, which is definitely not because Fleabag has a guinea pig that she carries around. The rabbit was very cute. I didn't mind the rabbit. She had more chemistry with the rabbit than she did with her supposed intended. In the end, despite my incredibly low expectations, Persuasion still managed to disappoint. It is worth a watch, just for the hell of it. Have some alcohol ready, drink it from the bottle like Anne Elliot does, and enjoy it as an incredibly bad, horrible, failed attempt at marketing Jane Austen to an audience of millennial women and completely failing at it because of some very lazy assumptions about what we like, what we do and how we speak. Persuasion also completely failed as a knockoff of Fleabag, because what Fleabag does really well is a sort of commentary on interpersonal relationships. Fleabag isn't really great on like social commentary, which Jane Austen does in Persuasion, specifically in the sort of nuanced take on the Navy and of a changing society, you know, from the old ways of the Elliot family to the more modern ways. So there's none of that. Just none of that at all in the film. It's also lacking in the observational commentary on how people interact with each other, which Fleabag does exceedingly well. Fleabag's all about the relationship between sisters, between Fleabag and her parents, between her and her lovers, and there is just none of that in Persuasion. What they took from Fleabag is pretty much just this. And that was it. Do let me know your opinion below, as I'm sure you will. Thank you for watching. Bye!